Hi, my name is Bethany and welcome to episode 9. Oh my gosh, we're almost to double digits. Episode 9 of the library. I wanted to kind of do a deep dive from a conversation that I started yesterday. I posted a short where I talked about how kind of a reflection of it's been 19 years since I lost my mom. My mom died of terminal cancer, and I was just wanting to remember the significance that yesterday is in my life, but also just reflect of like how far I've come in my journey of loss and grief. And inevitably that made me think about the books that I have read, or the books that I've read during times where I have been grieving or I've experienced loss or experienced hard times in my life, and the books that have helped me tremendously. So I thought that we would talk about those books. I actually tried to do this video a few days ago. And to be totally honest with you, I got really emotional when I was thinking about the impact that these books have had in my life. And so I had to like table the idea and come back to it. So I'm happy to tell you that I feel like today I can share this without, crying on the internet. Which there's no shame in that. I've done that. You guys know, but in order for it to be a productive conversation, this is what we need to do, right? Okay, so just this list of books will be available in the book list in my description. So if you find yourself looking for books that maybe will help you if you're going through a hard time or you're grieving or whatever the case may be, they're available. There's a myriad of ways that people process through their grief, whether they use music or physical activity. I know that there's been times in my life recently when I was processing through hardship, I took ballroom dance classes, and that was a joy and extremely healing for me. I've used music for sure. There have been songs that I've played on repeat because they felt so healing for me. Journaling, I've done that for sure. But it's probably no surprise that because reading is such an essential part of not just who I am, but part of my love, and how I process the world best is through a book, that it's no surprise that inevitably at some point during my grief journey, I'm going to pick up a book. And it's kind of been interesting to me because these books are not, I don't think that they are like grief help books. There are probably some great options for that. That's just, these books are not traditionally for grief, but they are books that have helped me in my grief, which have been really interesting. So, when my mom died, I was in college. And I just remember, like, it's devastating. Anytime you experience loss, it's just absolutely devastating. And my grief journey may look different if you've experienced grief from your grief journey, and that's okay. And there's a uniqueness to how individual the grief journey can be, but like how many ways that we can relate to one another. So what helps me may not help you, but if you need like maybe a suggestion, there you go. Okay, so this is a fictional book by Charles Martin, When Crickets Cry. And it's actually Charles Martin's first book. He's written like over 20 books by now. This is just, I love his writing. Usually his books take place in southern states. And I'm from the South, so that's very relatable to me. And it just so happened that this book was in North Georgia. And when my mom died, I was a college student in North Georgia. So this worked out perfectly. But this is a story. It says, a man with a painful past, a child with a doubtful future, and a shared journey towards healing for both of their hearts. And so the characters are processing through tremendously big things and things in their past and things in their future. And when they began that journey of healing both of their hearts, um, somehow I don't even know how I got this book. I have no memory of it, but this book was pivotal at helping me begin my journey of healing in my grief with missing my mom. So it is not the end all be all. I read this book. I started counseling. Um, I just learned to like, sometimes people say like grief is you walk with a limp. And sometimes it feels like that. But this book was extremely helpful for me and extremely like, excuse me, extremely like, I find that sometimes reading about a fictional character who's going through a hard time is actually very helpful for me when I'm going through a hard time. So, I actually read this book a few years ago for the second time. I read it once right after my mom died. And then a few years later, probably 10 plus years later, I was like, I want to read it again. And I picked it up and I was amazed at how much I remembered from the first time I read it, but also just how it was still just as, still just such a joy to read. So, When Crickets Cry by Charles Martin. Okay, so this book I read about a year and a half ago. I had a friend of mine, he recommended this book to me, and he said, I know you're a reader, and I think when you're processing through a hard season in your life, you might need a good book that you can read slowly. This is not a thick book. But this is by a Catholic priest named, I'm going to get his name wrong, okay, Henry J.M. Newen. And he wrote this book. It's actually journal entries. He was going through a really hard, difficult season. He felt very isolated. He was grieving. He felt very alone. And these are his journal entries as he's processing through that very difficult season. This book is called The Inner Voice of Love. And a few years ago when things in my family started changing, and I was so grieved by all these things that were happening, right? And I felt so isolated. And through that journey, I didn't read as much because I was so overwhelmed. Everything in our lives was changing, everything. And so I was grieving how everything was changing. I was grieving all the things in daily life that I was dealing with. But I missed reading. I felt like I had also lost that too. And so this was the first book that I read that wasn't physically painful for me to read. We can probably talk about that in depth at another time. But The Inner Voice of Love just felt like a hug that just let me know I wasn't alone and I was going to make it. And I needed that desperately. So I ended up reading a few other of his books. They were great. But I go back to this book just because there's a rawness and a realness, and you could feel his grief, and it so mimicked my own that it helped me not feel alone. So, The Inner Voice of Love by Henry J.M. Newen. This last one is probably no surprise if you know me. And so it's pretty well known that whether you are my acquaintance or you are my friend or, however you may know me, you probably know that I have a deep, deep love and respect for C.S. Lewis. And he is my favorite author. And so much of his work has impacted me tremendously. So this is a signature classics book that has, I think it has most of his nonfiction or fictional books. It doesn't have Chronicles of Narnia and it doesn't have the space trilogies, but this has his other main works. And so there's numerous books listed here, but I'm only going to highlight two because these were the ones that were... Actually, there's one missing. So hold on. Let's open it so I can tell you the right ones. Okay. So the books by C.S. Lewis that helped me over the last few years have been The Great Divorce, which, by the way, is not about divorce at all. Not marital divorce. But it was a really good book. It made me think. I love the way C.S. Lewis pens a sentence, because he will craft a sentence, or he will present an idea, and then you get to just wrestle through that. And I really appreciate that. And that's how I think and process the world best. And then a Grief Observed. And then there's one other one, but I'm not seeing it here. Okay, Surprised by Joy. And A Grief Observed is the book that he wrote right after his wife died. He was married for a few years, and his wife tragically passed away. It was such a raw book that he actually told his publishers he wasn't sure if there was a market for it, because it was so unlike his other books. It was just raw, and he was grieving, and it's just so, like, I actually wish that I had read that book after my mom died, but I was very glad I read it when I did. So it just was a really good Surprised by Joy, The Great Divorce. I find that anytime that I can read his books, I am refreshed. I am encouraged. And so I needed to have something that would like challenge my thought process, but would also be gentle. Because I felt so, when you go through hard times and you're grieving, you just feel raw and vulnerable and sad, and you need encouragement. And so these books were very helpful. It goes without saying, because I am a devout Christian, that the Bible was very essential to my grief journey, both when my mom died and most recently when things in my family changed. And it is this scripture that has carried me through dark times and has encouraged my heart. And it has been a tremendous source of peace and comfort and strength and truly guidance as well. So those were a few books. I'm very grateful for the legacy that my mom has and the impact she made in my life. I'm very grateful that on the other side of every tragedy, we meet hope. And sometimes in the midst of the tragedy, I know that in the midst of every tragedy and every grief that I've ever experienced, I have encountered hope, and that hope is Jesus. And I'm very grateful for that, because there have been many times where I have felt like I was shipwrecked, but I wasn't. There was a storm. Grief can feel like a storm, but it is also an opportunity, at least for me, to lean into the Lord and to trust Him. And I'm very grateful for these books. They've been tremendous in helping me. They were not the end-all, be-all guidance for me navigating my grief. There's a lot of components to that, a lot of counseling, a lot of therapy, a lot of journaling, all the things. But they were one component of my grief journey that was particularly impactful. So there you go. I'm so glad I got to share these books with you. I'm really happy I didn't cry. There's nothing wrong with crying. I just didn't want to cry. I wanted to be able to share this with you. So thanks so much for being here. Have a great day.